Imagine waking up one morning, making your coffee, turning on the morning news, and realizing that the massive nuclear-armed empire you live in,
A state that spans, what, 11 time zones?
yeah, 11 time zones, a sixth of the Earth's landmass, you realize it is simply dissolved,
Just gone.
completely gone. And not in a fiery apocalypse or, through a catastrophic bloody civil war that leveled cities.
Right, it happened bureaucratically.
Exactly, quietly, by the stroke of a pen. And that is exactly the reality that millions of people woke up to in late December 1991 with the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. Okay, let's unpack this because it remains one of the most stunning, counterintuitive geopolitical transformations in human history.
Absolutely.
We're embarking on a deep dive today into a massive stack of historical analyses, macroeconomic data, and historiographical literature. It's all synthesized into the title, The Disintegration of the Soviet Union, an exhaustive analysis of systemic, economic, and political drivers.
A very heavy stack of reading.
Oh, extremely heavy. But our mission for this deep dive is to figure out exactly why and how a global superpower, one that commanded tens of thousands of nuclear weapons and governed over 100 distinct nationalities, simply vanished from the map.
Because for a long time, the popular simplified narrative you'd hear was just, well, communism was always doomed to fail.
Right, that fatalistic shorthand. But the sources in front of us push far past that. We're looking at an incredibly nuanced, highly contingent mix of structural decay, cascading economic missteps.
And deeply cynical choices made by the elites.
Yes, the very people entrusted to keep the system running.
The historical contrast here is what really makes this text so compelling. When we look back at the broad sweep of history, the baseline expectation for the fragmentation of an empire of this sheer magnitude is, well, protracted catastrophic violence.
Like a fall of Rome.
Exactly. Or the bloody multi-generational fracturing of the Ottoman Empire, or the sheer devastation of the Austro-Hungarian collapse.
Right.
Yet the demise of the Soviet state was, by comparison, a remarkably peaceful decapitation.
Which is wild when you think about the nuclear arsenal involved.
Totally wild. To truly comprehend the mechanics of this event, the literature requires us to look at a synergy of factors. We are dealing with macro-level system failures.
Flaws basically baked into the blueprint of the state.
Right, colliding violently with the micro-level incentives of ordinary humans who were just trying to survive a failing system.
Yeah.
It's the story of a bureaucratic behemoth that perhaps could have limped along for decades longer in a state of stagnation had its leadership not initiated a series of spectacularly poorly calibrated reforms.
And that is exactly why this matters to you, the listener. Because understanding this incredibly complex collapse isn't just an exercise in Cold War history. It helps us understand how massive, seemingly invincible institutions in our own modern world can rot from the inside out.
It's about what happens when the foundational ideology of a society cracks under the weight of its own internal contradictions.
And how quickly the people inside that system will abandon it when their personal incentives shift. So, to really get a grip on this, we have to start where the text starts, which is the economic foundation.
Right, the root of the rot.
Yeah. There is a tendency to view the 1980s as the definitive era of Soviet decline. But the research points out that the architectural flaws for this collapse were poured into the concrete decades earlier.
Because in the 1950s, the Soviet economy was actually booming.
It was. They were experiencing massive double-digit growth. But the economists in our sources classify this as extensive growth.
Right, the brute force mobilization of labor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Mass collectivization, pouring millions of tons of concrete, building massive steel foundries, and shifting millions of peasants from the countryside into urban factories.
And that brute force approach functions incredibly well under one specific condition.
Which is?
When you are rapidly industrializing an agrarian society from scratch. If you take a peasant population, put them in a factory, and mandate that they build tractors, your national output is going to skyrocket on paper.
And it did.
Right.
I mean, in the 1950s, Soviet economic growth significantly outpaced the global average.
Which generated genuine, fervent optimism within the Communist Party leadership. Figures like Nikita Khrushchev truly believed that central administrative planning was the globally viable economic model of the future.
That they would inevitably, quote, bury the capitalist West in sheer production.
Exactly. But the fundamental trap, however, is that an economy eventually exhausts its reserves of cheap labor and easily accessible raw materials.
You run out of peasants to move to the cities.
Precisely. At that point, to continue growing, an economy must transition from extensive growth.
Just throwing more bodies and more coal at a quota.
Right, to intensive growth. Intensive growth is driven by technological innovation, efficiency, optimization, and doing more with less.
And the overarching tragedy of the Soviet administrative command economy is that it proves structurally, almost biologically, incapable of making that evolutionary leap.
They just couldn't do it.
Let's look at the data that illustrates that failure, because it paints a stark picture of systemic exhaustion. The gross domestic product growth rates really tell the whole story.
The drop is severe.
Yeah. Between 1980 and 1985, their GDP was growing at roughly 4.7%. But by the 1986 to 1990 period, that rate had plummeted to 2.9%.
And on paper, they still had the second largest nominal GDP in the world by 1990.
Estimated by some metrics at over $2.6 trillion in purchasing power parity.
But the vital dynamism of the economy was entirely gone. They were a top-heavy behemoth where 80% of the economy was dedicated to heavy industry.
And 20% to agriculture.
Leaving almost absolutely nothing for consumer goods.
Right. And a massive, undeniable driver of this stagnation, according to the sources, was the sheer staggering burden of their military-industrial complex.
The drain caused by militarization cannot be overstated.
Because the Soviet Union was bound by a geopolitical and ideological commitment to maintain absolute strategic nuclear and conventional parity with the United States.
Furthermore, they were funding a vast, incredibly expensive external empire.
Right, providing heavy sustained subsidies to client states in Eastern Europe through the Warsaw Pact and the Comecon trade network.
Bankrolling regimes in Cuba and Vietnam.
And actively funding various Marxist-Leninist insurgencies across the Third World.
Which resulted in an unceasing outward hemorrhage of vital capital. The historical estimates indicate that the defense burden rose from around 10 to 13% of their total GDP in 1960 to an astonishing 15 to 16% by the mid to late 1980s.
Just to put that in perspective for you listening, when a state allocates that massive a percentage of its productive capacity solely to the military, it is systematically starving its civilian sector.
Starving it of capital investment, advanced technology, and skilled labor.
The analogy that jumps out from reading this is like watching a bodybuilder who obsesses over working out their right arm and absolutely nothing else.
That is a great visual.
Right. Sure, that single arm is incredibly powerful, it's terrifying, it can punch through a brick wall, but the rest of the body is atrophying to the point where the person can barely stand up under their own weight.
The text points out that this extreme lopsided militarization meant the Soviet state could produce prodigious, world-leading amounts of raw steel.
They could construct terrifyingly advanced titanium-hulled nuclear submarines.
And build complex spacecraft. But simultaneously, they were wholly incapable of providing basic domestic amenities.
Like reliable refrigerators or quality shoes or adequate housing for their own citizens.
Chronic, grinding shortages of everyday consumer goods didn't just happen occasionally.
No, they became the defining, inescapable feature of daily Soviet life.
And the fascinating element here is how this structural deceleration was actually camouflaged for over a decade.
By a massive external shock.
Exactly, the influx of petrodollars. In the 1970s, the global energy crises, triggered largely by the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and the subsequent oil embargoes, caused global oil prices to skyrocket.
And because the Soviet Union was, and its successor states remain, a massive exporter of hydrocarbons, this generated a gargantuan, unexpected windfall of hard currency for Moscow.
This sudden, immense wealth allowed the highly conservative administration of Leonid Brezhnev to essentially bankroll their superannuated, increasingly outdated industrial infrastructure.
They could maintain vast domestic subsidies, keep the price of bread artificially low, and project immense military power across the globe.
All without undertaking any of the painful systemic economic reforms that their own economists knew were necessary for long-term survival.
But relying on the export of unrefined natural resources to mask domestic inefficiency makes an economy highly brittle.
Because when global oil prices eventually stabilized and then began a steep decline in the 1980s, that temporary financial bandage was violently ripped off.
The underlying rot of the Soviet industrial base was suddenly fully exposed.
And that exposure leads us directly into one of the most mind-boggling sections of the source material.
The computing gap. We are talking about the dawn of the information age, the pivot from the industrial era to the digital era. Now, the Soviet state heavily almost religiously, subsidized the hard sciences.
They beat the U.S. to space. They launched Sputnik in 1957.
They landed robotic probes on the surface of Venus. I mean, when Joseph Stalin died, the USSR was arguably the world's third most proficient computing power.
But the text drops a jaw-dropping statistic.
By 1986, the entire Soviet Union possessed slightly more than 10,000 computers.
While the United States, in that exact same year, had an estimated 1.3 million.
10,000 versus 1.3 million. That is just...
The magnitude of that disparity forces us to ask how a scientific superpower, a nation of brilliant engineers and physicists, falls that dramatically behind in the most critical technology of the late 20th century.
And the root cause lay in the fundamental incompatibility between the rigid logic of a centralized command economy and the demands of rapid, decentralized technological innovation.
The Soviet system suffered from an extreme state-level manifestation of what business strategists call the innovator's dilemma.
Right. In a market system, the relentless pressure of competition and the existential threat posed by new startups force incumbent companies to adopt disruptive technologies.
Even if it cannibalizes their current profits.
But in the Soviet Union, there was no competition. Enterprise managers operated under strict, inflexible, state-mandated production quotas dictated by the Central Planning Agency, Gosplan, in Moscow.
To make that real for you, imagine a factory manager is driving a heavy truck on a long road trip.
Okay.
And they are given a strict, uncompromising quota from their boss. You must cover 500 miles today, or you will lose your job, your housing, and possibly go to prison.
High stakes.
Very. They see a mechanic shop on the side of the road where they could stop, upgrade to a far more efficient engine, and ultimately drive much faster in the long run.
But stopping takes a week.
Exactly. If they stop to innovate, they will definitively miss today's quota.
So the completely rational choice for that manager is to just keep driving the old, inefficient truck until the engine eventually seizes up and dies.
The literature emphasizes that implementing new technology wasn't viewed as a career-making opportunity in the Soviet system.
It was a severe professional hazard.
And there was zero financial incentive to take that risk. Even if a manager somehow managed to make their factory more efficient, they weren't allowed to keep the surplus profits to raise worker wages or invest in better equipment.
No, the central planners in Moscow would simply see the surplus, confiscate it, and raise the quota for the following year.
The incentive structure was entirely punitive.
When top party officials, realizing they were falling behind the West, actually attempted to introduce computerized management information systems to optimize industrial production, the factory managers actively, covertly resisted them.
Because the managers intuitively understood that if their factories were accurately digitized and their true production capacities were visible on a mainframe in Moscow, the central planners would see that the managers had been routinely hoarding raw materials and overstating their performance metrics.
The tragic irony is that these illicit practices of hoarding supplies and fudging numbers were practically necessary just to survive the irrational, often impossible demands of the central plan.
Consequently, the few computers that were installed were deliberately relegated to simple, localized accounting tasks.
The data shows that complex systemic optimization accounted for only 1 to 5% of total computer use in the Soviet Union.
But if the systemic disincentives weren't enough, there was also a bizarre, self-imposed ideological paralysis.
The sources detail how the dogmatic logic of Marxist-Leninist statism literally captured and stifled scientific inquiry.
From 1930 up until the late 1950s, the use of advanced mathematics, things like calculus or linear programming in economic research, was completely banned.
Banned. Why? Simply because advanced calculus wasn't present in the original 19th century texts of Karl Marx.
Soviet economists were legally restricted to using basic arithmetic to try and plan an economy of hundreds of millions of people.
There is an incredible, tragic quote in the text from the prominent Polish economist Oskar Lange, who described this ideological blinding. He said, restricting economists from using math was like an astronomer prevented from observing the sky.
It's almost unfathomable how a state trying to compete globally would intentionally handicap its own brightest minds over 19th century dogma.
It represents a profound tragedy of ideological rigidity.
But the technological lag was further exacerbated by something even more visceral: the state's overarching institutional paranoia regarding the free flow of information.
The Communist Party recognized that their monopoly on political power depended entirely on their monopoly on information.
They viewed any computer connected to a printer not as a tool for economic growth, but as a potential uncontrolled printing press.
They were terrified of what they called samizdat,
The underground illegal copying and distribution of dissident anti-Soviet literature.
To maintain their grip on the narrative, the state enforced strict draconian bans on the individual ownership of personal computers and photocopiers right up until the Gorbachev era.
Every typewriter in the country had its typeface registered with the KGB so documents could be traced.
Which is just by obsessively trying to control the present, they completely sabotaged their future. Because they banned personal computers, they actively prevented the organic development of a domestic software industry.
There was no garage hacker culture in the Soviet Union.
There was no Steve Jobs or Bill Gates tinkering in a basement, because doing so was a state crime.
They remained stubbornly tethered to this outdated paradigm of massive, centralized mainframe computers.
Which fit perfectly with their ideological preference for centralized control and what scholars call gigantomania.
While the capitalist West was moving rapidly toward agile, decentralized, networked personal computing.
Their scientists frequently had to rely on slide rules and abacuses, and even their prize space programs suffered because their onboard computing systems were entirely subpar compared to their American counterparts.
And as the globalized world became increasingly interconnected via telecommunications, the informational isolation of the Soviet populace became impossible to maintain.
The slow but steady penetration of Western communication technologies, even in highly limited and illicit forms, began to starkly highlight the massive disparity in living standards between the two ideological blocs.
As Soviet citizens gained access to Western radio broadcasts, or managed to acquire highly coveted black market consumer goods.
Things as simple as Western rock and roll records, VHS tapes, and denim blue jeans.
The abstract economic failure began to transform into a profound, deeply personal political crisis.
The sociological data describes this period as a societal paradigm shift, a sudden shattering of the illusion.
The citizenry began to realize, undeniably, that democratic, market-oriented societies were providing a vastly superior quality of life.
The grand ideological promise that socialism would inevitably overtake capitalism was visibly, tangibly crumbling in the hands of anyone holding a pair of smuggled Levi's.
So we have this massive edifice. It has long-term structural weakness, severe technological stagnation, and a military drain that is bleeding it dry.
The system is decaying, but it hasn't collapsed.
It takes a spark to turn decay into an explosion.
And the historical consensus points directly to the attempts to fix the system as the very things that destroyed it.
Enter Mikhail Gorbachev in 1985 and his flagship policy of perestroika, or economic restructuring.
Gorbachev looks at this moribund economy and realizes he has to inject some dynamism into it, or the Soviet Union will lose its superpower status.
But according to the macroeconomic data in the source material, perestroika didn't revitalize the economy. It effectively, systematically dismantled it.
By the first quarter of 1991, the Soviet gross national product had plummeted by an absolutely staggering 8% relative to the previous year.
The economic analysis from this period is critical because it shows that this unprecedented contraction wasn't primarily caused by exogenous shocks.
It wasn't a sudden global depression or a massive natural disaster.
It was a highly volatile, internally generated crisis brought on by halfway measures. Gorbachev's reforms were inherently, fatally partial.
He loosened the strict top-down controls of the central command economy, giving factory managers more autonomy.
But he did absolutely nothing to lay the necessary institutional, legal, or pricing foundations for a functioning market economy.
It was the absolute worst of both worlds. He pulled the authoritarian rug out from under the command structure, leaving a chaotic, unregulated void where neither the plan nor the market functioned.
The statistical drop across all major industrial sectors is just devastating.
By early 1991, coal production was down 18%. The manufacturing of farm equipment fell by 25%. New housing construction dropped 27%.
Even the production of basic, everyday consumer staples collapsed. Sugar production down 21%, processed meat down 14%.
How does an entire, massively industrialized economy just spontaneously grind to a halt like that?
The sources point to a very specific, fatal economic mechanism that took hold during perestroika: repressed inflation.
Repressed inflation is a fascinating, highly destructive economic phenomenon, and its implementation in the Soviet Union was a masterclass in policy failure.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, here is the mechanics of how it occurred. The state enacted a catastrophic combination of monetary and pricing policies.
Under the newly loosened rules of perestroika, the state allowed the nominal wages for workers to rise significantly, attempting to boost morale and productivity. Wages climbed 16.9% in 1990 alone.
Simultaneously, the state was running massive, expanding budget deficits due to falling oil revenues and an anti-alcohol campaign that wiped out tax receipts.
So, to cover this caving deficit, they simply turned on the printing presses and flooded the economy with rubles.
The M2 money supply, which is essentially the total amount of cash and easily accessible money in circulation, saw its growth accelerate wildly from 6.1% in 1986 to a hyperinflationary 21.5% in 1990.
However, and this is the pin on the grenade, they kept official state consumer prices rigidly fixed at artificially low levels.
Let's translate that M2 money supply concept into everyday terms.
Imagine you work at a factory, and suddenly your boss gives you a massive raise. You and everyone else in your town have pockets full of cash. You feel rich.
But when you go to the local grocery store to buy dinner, the prices on the shelf haven't changed, but the shelves themselves are completely, entirely bare.
Because there is suddenly so much extra cash chasing the exact same limited number of goods, and because the state forbids the store from raising prices to balance the demand, everything sells out the instant it hits the shelf.
Your newly printed money is effectively useless. The ruble became little more than colorful paper.
And because the physical currency lost its fundamental value as a medium of exchange, time became the primary currency of the Soviet Union.
Time replacing money is a vital conceptual shift to understand the collapse of everyday life.
The source material estimates that Soviet citizens, collectively, spent an astonishing 30 million man-years annually just standing in queues.
That equates to roughly 25% of the waking time of every single adult in the country.
Imagine the psychological toll. You finish a grueling shift at a steel mill, and then you stand in the freezing cold for 4 hours just on the rumor that a shipment of boots or toilet paper might arrive at a local store.
Citizens carried what they called an avoska, a string, just-in-case bag, everywhere they went, ready to jump into any line they saw, regardless of what was being sold.
Because they could always trade it later.
Exactly. When a quarter of your adult life is consumed by standing in line hoping to procure basic caloric necessities, it fundamentally alters your psychological state and your economic incentives.
Workers rationally recognized that earning more rubles was utterly pointless if there were no physical goods available to purchase with those rubles.
If the money you earn can't buy anything, why on earth would you work hard?
Why would you even show up? And the official data entirely backs up this collapse in motivation. Productive labor input plummeted across the board.
Official industrial absenteeism, which the state politely categorized as losses of time, soared to 50 million man days in 1990 alone.
That was a 70% increase over the average from just a couple of years prior.
It wasn't laziness. It was a perfectly logical human reaction to a completely broken incentive structure.
But this dysfunction didn't stop at the factory floor. It was happening at the highest levels of enterprise management, too, manifesting in behaviors the sources call input hoarding and supply diversion.
Because perestroika granted state enterprises greater autonomy, enterprise managers suddenly found themselves operating in this chaotic environment of repressed inflation.
Historically, under the strict plan, a manager of a factory producing steel bearings was supposed to deliver those bearings to a downstream tractor factory at artificially low, state-mandated prices.
But under the new lax rules, why would the steel manager do that? The rubles they would receive from the tractor factory were worthless.
Instead, they began hoarding their output. This systemic input hoarding caused massive, cascading downstream bottlenecks.
The tractor factory couldn't build tractors because they had no bearings. The farms couldn't harvest wheat because they had no tractors.
Aggregate production stalled across the entire country, even when the raw materials theoretically existed somewhere else in the supply chain.
And if these managers weren't hoarding their goods, they were actively diverting them.
Supply diversion became an absolute epidemic that bled the state dry. Enterprises would illegally take their output, refuse to send it where the state demanded, and instead resell it on the black market. Or they would sell it to the newly legalized private cooperatives at massive markups.
The text gives a stunning example. State oil refineries were routinely, blatantly diverting fuel to these private cooperatives at 3 times the official state price.
This meant that the state-run logistics networks, the trains, and the critical agricultural sector were completely starved of the diesel fuel they desperately needed to transport food into the cities.
It is a total ground-up breakdown of a complex society's logistics.
As the ruble's irrelevance became absolute, it catalyzed the fantastic, almost medieval regression to a primitive barter economy.
Massive industrial enterprises began directly trading their output for consumer commodities.
A factory making heavy industrial pipes wouldn't sell them for cash. They would load them on a train and trade them directly to a collective farm for potatoes and meat.
Or trade them to a textile plant for winter coats, just so they could distribute those physical goods directly to their own workforce to prevent them from quitting.
It was a regression to pre-monetary trade, bypassing the central banking system entirely. It's an astounding image. You have a nuclear-armed superpower capable of destroying the world many times over, resorting to trading steel pipes for potatoes just to keep its workforce fed.
And alongside this economic chaos naturally came a total breakdown in law and order. The theft of state property rose by nearly 1/3 in 1990, and then spiked another 39% in the first quarter of 1991.
By late 1990, the percentage of enterprises simply failing to meet their legally binding contractual delivery obligations rose from 17% to 23%.
The intricate, highly interdependent supply chains of the Soviet economy were shattering into a million pieces.
The immediate political consequence of this logistical shattering was profound. As the central state in Moscow visibly lost control of distribution, regional and local authorities panicked.
They responded by enacting aggressive protectionist embargoes. Local mayors and regional party bosses refused to allow goods to be exported beyond their own local borders because they were desperately trying to insulate their own populations from the cascading shortages.
They set up checkpoints to stop trucks from leaving their districts. This effectively severed the economic arteries of the entire Soviet Union, drastically accelerating the collapse of central political authority.
So we established that perestroika accidentally but systematically destroys the economic apparatus.
But Gorbachev had a companion policy, glasnost, which translates to openness or transparency.
And if perestroika broke the physical economy, the sources argue that glasnost completely fatally undermined the ideological and moral legitimacy of the entire state.
Now, it's crucial to understand that Gorbachev didn't initiate glasnost because he was a sudden, bleeding-heart convert to Western-style free speech and civil liberties. The sources note it was initiated as a calculated utilitarian political tool in the mid-1980s.
Precisely. Gorbachev was a pragmatist. He recognized that to force through his economic restructuring, he had to overcome the deeply entrenched, stubborn resistance of the conservative, hardline communist bureaucracy, the nomenklatura, who benefited from the stagnation.
To break their power, he needed allies outside the party apparatus.
He sought to mobilize the Soviet intelligentsia, the writers, academics, and journalists, and the broader public by finally exposing the systemic corruption, the extreme inefficiencies, and the bureaucratic incompetence that the hardliners had long kept hidden in the dark.
He believed he could harness public outrage as a weapon to force the conservatives to accept his reforms.
But, as is so often the case in history, once you open the floodgates of suppressed information, you absolutely cannot control where the water goes.
When Gorbachev officially lifted the draconian censorship laws in 1988, he catalyzed a vigorous, entirely uncontrollable public reckoning with the Soviet Union's violent, oppressive past.
You have to remember the context here. For 70 years, this regime had maintained its authority through a very carefully curated, heroic historical narrative.
The Great Patriotic War, the triumph of the worker, the flawless march toward communism.
Glasnost shattered that mythos irreparably. Suddenly, the media is emancipated. They start publishing previously banned literature, authors like Boris Pasternak and Anatoly Rybakov, whose works detailed the horrors of the state.
And the newly emboldened press begins broadcasting harrowing, undeniable details of historical atrocities.
The psychological impact of this abrupt transparency on the Soviet populace was profound and destabilizing.
The state permitted the first public exhibitions detailing the sheer scale of the crimes of Stalinism. The source material highlights the wall of sorrow erected in Moscow.
This wasn't abstract statistics. It provided irrefutable visual evidence of state-sponsored terror, detailing the individual lives of victims of the regime, the millions sent to the gulags or executed in the purges.
This unfettered public discussion of the system's incredibly violent origins rapidly undercut the fundamental moral foundation of the Communist Party.
The exposure of the state's legacy of violence eroded whatever lingering, passive support existed for the Soviet system. It acted as a fundamental ideological destabilizer.
It is one thing for a citizen to accept that their government is economically inefficient. It is entirely another for them to be confronted with undeniable, daily proof that the state they serve was built upon mass murder and lies.
There is a chilling, incredibly perceptive observation from the State Foreign Ministry spokesperson at the time, Gennady Gerasimov, quoted in the text.
He noted that it was ultimately glasnost that destroyed the regime because citizens, and I'm quoting here, opened their eyes and saw what kind of a country they were living in, and they looked at the nation's horrible history.
The foundational, unifying myth of the society was shattered overnight.
Imagine believing your whole life that your country is the moral vanguard of human progress, and then turning on the television to see newly unearthed mass graves of your own countrymen, put there by the very KGB officers who still police your streets.
The devastating potential of this newfound transparency was irrevocably accelerated by a singular, tragic, and highly visible event.
The Chernobyl nuclear disaster on April 26, 1986.
The catastrophic explosion of the unique Soviet-designed RBMK reactor in Ukraine laid bare everything that was systemically wrong with the state.
The RBMK design itself, lacking the robust containment structure standard in the West, built that way simply to save money and meet quotas, was a testament to the system's flaws.
The disaster exposed the profound bureaucratic dysfunction, the deeply ingrained culture of secrecy, and the technological stagnation of the Soviet state to the entire world, and more importantly, to its own people.
Initially, true to form, the state attempted to maintain its traditional posture of absolute denial.
They downplayed the catastrophe to the international community, waiting days to admit what happened, and unforgivably, they lied to their own citizens living in the fallout zone.
There is a detail from the sources regarding Chernobyl that is just horrifying, and it perfectly encapsulates this betrayal. In the immediate days following the explosion, while the reactor was literally still burning and spewing radioactive isotopes into the atmosphere, the central government actively permitted the casual carrying out of the traditional May Day demonstrations in Kyiv.
Families, children marching in the open streets, a mere 130 kilometers from the smoldering reactor core.
They did this purely to maintain the optical illusion of normalcy, knowingly exposing their own people to radioactive fallout.
But the sheer scale of the environmental and humanitarian disaster, the radioactive clouds sweeping over Europe, meant that long-term obfuscation was impossible.
Chernobyl functioned as a gruesome, undeniable metaphor for the Soviet state as a whole.
A massive, complex system undergoing a meltdown because the operators disabled safety protocols to run an ill-conceived test.
It revealed a massive bureaucracy that prioritized the accumulation of production quotas and the maintenance of political face over the basic physical survival of its citizens.
Sociologists analyzed the aftermath of Chernobyl through the conceptual lens of the risk society.
The state, which had always derived its legitimacy from the promise of socialist protection and cradle-to-grave security, was now viewed by its own people as fundamentally, inherently hazardous to their very existence.
Systemic negligence wasn't just causing bread shortages, it was actively poisoning the populace.
For Gorbachev, the disaster actually reinforced his belief that they had to overcome this regressive, deadly culture of secrecy. It prompted him to double down on glasnost.
But the ultimate unintended consequence of that transparency was the total obliteration of public trust in government authorities.
Chernobyl became a potent, unifying rallying point for environmental and nationalist movements across the various republics, particularly in Ukraine and Belarus, which bore the brunt of the fallout.
It proved to the citizenry that the central government in Moscow wasn't just financially broke, it was lethal.
The mobilization of public anger over issues like Chernobyl leads us perfectly into the next crucial phase of our analysis: ethnofederalism and the tidal wave of nationalism.
To truly grasp the mechanics of the collapse, we must recognize that the demise of the Soviet Union was inherently an imperial collapse.
But it was an empire uniquely structured by a very specific, volatile institutional architecture. The USSR was built upon what political scientists call an ethno-federal system.
This ethno-federal concept is fascinating. What it means is that the Soviet Union utilized a sort of faux form of national sovereignty.
When the empire was constructed, they deliberately delineated territories based on ethnic nationalities. They drew borders and created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Georgian SSR, the Lithuanian SSR, and so on.
They gave these republics their own nominal parliaments, their own flags, their own ministries, and their own local academies of science.
But for decades, everyone understood this was largely window dressing. It was designed to placate local cultures while masking the reality of highly centralized, iron-fisted dictatorial control radiating from Moscow.
The political scientist Mark Beisinger, cited heavily in the text, argues that this ethno-federal structure was a massive existential vulnerability.
When the central authority of Moscow began to rapidly wane under the dual pressures of economic failure and the exposure brought by glasnost, nationalism didn't just organically materialize out of thin air.
It surfaced so rapidly and so powerfully, precisely because it could be instantly channeled through these pre-existing, ready-made institutional frameworks.
For decades, the strict security forces of the KGB had ruthlessly prevented the nationalist intelligentsia from organizing.
But once Gorbachev relaxed censorship and retracted those coercive security forces, it created the necessary political space for opposition to organize legally using the very parliaments the Soviets had built for them.
The structural analogy here is brilliant. It's like the architects of the Soviet Union built a massive sprawling house, but for some reason, they pre-installed demolition charges inside the load-bearing walls of every single room.
They gave each ethnic group a defined border, a parliament, and a bureaucracy.
They just assumed with absolute arrogance that no one would ever be allowed to light the fuse. But then Gorbachev's glasnost essentially handed everyone a match.
The ethno-federal structure provided ready-made administrative apparatuses that could instantly be repurposed for independence.
And crucially, it provided local elites, the local communist mayors and party bosses, who proved incredibly adept at transitioning overnight from loyal communist functionaries to fervent nationalist leaders.
The initial, most visible fissures in the empire appeared in the periphery, specifically in the Baltic republics of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
By 1988, a powerful anti-imperial sovereignty frame gained massive, unprecedented resonance there.
These states possessed a unique historical context within the Union. They were independent nations between the world wars and were only forcibly annexed following the cynical 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact.
Therefore, they possessed a distinct, living historical memory of interwar independence. The older generation remembered what it was like to not be Soviet.
They also represented the most geographically and culturally westernized populations in the Union.
Utilizing the new political space opened by Gorbachev, reform-minded communists and newly formed grassroots populists coalesced into massive popular fronts, such as Sąjūdis in Lithuania, to formally demand autonomy and eventually full secession.
The sheer scale of their civil resistance was breathtaking, and it utilized optics that Moscow simply didn't know how to counter.
The sources highlight an event known as the Baltic Way, which took place on August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Nazi-Soviet pact.
An estimated 2 million people formed a continuous, unbroken human chain stretching 400 miles across Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania.
2 million people, holding hands across 3 countries, peacefully but forcefully demanding the end of Soviet rule.
It's an incredible, indelible image of defiance, and the resounding success of the Baltic movements triggered a rapid wave of what the scholars in the text call modular emulation.
Modular emulation is a critical sociological concept in understanding the domino effect of the collapse.
Nationalist movements in other vastly different republics, Georgia in the Caucasus, Moldova, Ukraine, watched the Baltic protests on television and consciously adopted their rhetoric.
Their peaceful protest tactics and their specific legal strategies for challenging Moscow's authority.
They attempted to reproduce that Baltic success throughout the Union to consolidate their own secessionist power and completely overwhelm the Kremlin's capacity to contain the unrest.
The massive Ukrainian nationalist movement, known as Ruch, actively utilized these examples to mobilize millions of supporters.
It created this cascading tidal context where successful, unpunished resistance in one geographic region profoundly degraded the psychological stability and the perceived authority of the state in all the others.
But it's important to note that the collapse of central authority wasn't always a peaceful human chain. The severe terminal limits of Moscow's power were brutally exposed in the Caucasus, specifically regarding the incredibly complex Nagorno-Karabakh conflict.
In 1988, the Armenian-majority Autonomous Oblast of Nagorno-Karabakh, which was geographically situated inside the borders of the Azerbaijan SSR, passed a formal resolution demanding reunification with Soviet Armenia.
And the brilliant disruptive part was that they actually cited self-determination laws that were technically embedded but never previously honored within the Soviet constitution to do it.
This explosive demand was rooted in deep, long-standing historical grievances regarding cultural suppression, religious differences, and demographic manipulation by Azerbaijani authorities.
Yet the immediate result of this political demand was a wave of horrific ethnic pogroms and communal violence sweeping across the region.
And this is the precise moment where the impotence of the central government became undeniable to everyone watching. Moscow's clumsy, delayed attempts to restore order by deploying military troops only managed to alienate everyone involved.
The text mentions a declassified CIA assessment from the time that perfectly captured the Kremlin's paralysis.
It observed how Soviet concessions were entirely insufficient to satisfy the Armenians who wanted full integration.
While Soviet military interference generated deep, violent resentment among Azerbaijanis, who perceived Russian favoritism toward Armenia.
The central government in Moscow was utterly paralyzed, unable to formulate a coherent policy.
The conflict proved, viscerally, that the mighty Soviet state could no longer guarantee the basic physical security of its citizens or enforce internal cohesion between its own republics.
It was a fatal stress test. It proved to every other republic that the Kremlin's coercive apparatus was breaking down under the weight of inter-ethnic warfare.
Yet despite the massive turmoil in the peripheries, the Baltics and the Caucasus, the most decisive, fatal blow to the Soviet state ultimately came from the imperial core itself, Russia.
By 1990, a profound de-Sovietization of Russian national identity had rapidly occurred. This is a fascinating, pivotal psychological shift.
The Russian populace, who were enduring the same severe economic deprivation, the same repressed inflation, standing in those same endless queues, increasingly began to dissociate their own national identity from the broader Soviet state.
Consider how quickly fundamental identities can shift when the social contract breaks.
In just a few short years, Russian citizens went from viewing themselves as the privileged, guiding core of a grand global empire to viewing themselves as the prime victims of it.
Many Russians, fueled by newly uncensored data, began to deeply resent the massive economic subsidies that Moscow was sending out to prop up the poorer republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus.
They felt their own wealth was being drained to maintain an ungrateful empire. They felt they were being exploited by the very apparatus they supposedly ruled.
And this shifting, resentful Russian identity was astutely, brilliantly weaponized by Boris Yeltsin.
Yeltsin was the highly charismatic, populist president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, by far the largest and wealthiest republic within the USSR.
Yeltsin recognized the shifting winds. He explicitly embraced the rhetoric of Russian sovereignty.
He essentially took the surging nationalist tide that had swept the Baltics and redirected it directly against Gorbachev's central government in the Kremlin.
This initiated a chaotic, legal, and political battle that became known as the War of Laws.
The War of Laws is where the bureaucracy finally eats itself. Following a wave of Republican elections in 1990, nationalist movements, or at least politicians highly sympathetic to them, came to power in almost every single republic except in the highly conservative Central Asian states.
These new Republican governments, led by Yeltsin's Russia, began passing aggressive legislation asserting that their local laws held absolute supremacy over any all-union decrees coming from Gorbachev in Moscow.
They actively, brazenly withheld tax revenues from the federal budget. They seized legal jurisdiction over massive natural resources, oil, timber, and heavy industrial enterprises located on their territory.
The institutional disorder became absolute. The Soviet state essentially splintered into national pieces because the Republican nomenklatura, the communist elite, the factory directors, and the bureaucracy at the local level defected en masse.
This deprived the political center in Moscow of its critical administrative transmission belts.
The local elite astutely recognized that the Marxist-Leninist project was fundamentally exhausted and economically bankrupt. Anticipating the inevitable demise of the state, they rapidly, cynically reinvented themselves as ardent nationalists.
This raises an important question. Why?
The answer is profound. To secure their own continuing political power and, vitally, to position themselves to facilitate the massive impending privatization of state property directly into their own personal hands.
This is perhaps the most crucial realization of the entire deep dive. To save themselves and to get rich, the communist functionaries became nationalist capitalists.
A factory boss realized that if the Soviet Union falls, but his republic becomes independent, he can simply claim ownership of the factory he manages.
The elite actively facilitated the collapse because it was immensely profitable for them to do so. Now, we need to shift our focus slightly, because this profound internal disintegration didn't happen in a vacuum.
It brings us to the external pressures and the domestic backlash from the very people the state claimed to represent.
While the domestic structural factors we've discussed were paramount, the international environment fundamentally altered the psychological calculus of both the Soviet leadership and the rebellious populations.
First and foremost among these external factors, the bleeding quagmire of the Soviet-Afghan War.
The 1979 invasion of Afghanistan cast a long, debilitating, and incredibly toxic shadow over the final decade of the USSR.
The source material breaks down how this conflict acted as a profound structural causal factor in the state's breakdown through several synergistic mechanisms. First, there were the perception effects.
The war shattered the carefully cultivated myth of the Red Army's absolute invincibility.
For years, conservative Soviet leaders believed they could always rely on massive, overwhelming military force to suppress internal dissent, frequently citing how the Red Army successfully subjugated the Central Asian Khanates in the 1920s.
But the humiliating, protracted failure of the modern Soviet military to defeat the technologically inferior Afghan Mujahideen proved to the leadership and to the world that military force was no longer a viable, guaranteed tool for sustaining the empire.
And second, there were the internal military effects. The conflict deeply, irreparably discredited the Red Army itself in the eyes of the public.
Its moral legitimacy was eroded by widespread, newly uncensored reports of gross corruption, rampant looting, and severe drug abuse among the conscripted soldiers fighting in the mountains.
This created a dangerous, volatile cleavage between the military brass, who felt abandoned by politicians, and the Communist Party leadership.
But crucially, as the sources point out, showing the world that the Red Army wasn't an invincible juggernaut emboldened the non-Russian republics.
If the army couldn't control Kabul, could it realistically control Vilnius or Tbilisi? They began to push for independence with significantly less fear of a devastating military backlash.
Third, and perhaps most damaging domestically, were the legitimacy effects.
The non-Russian minorities within the Soviet Union increasingly viewed the Afghan conflict not as a defense of socialism, but as a Russian imperial war that was being fought disproportionately by non-Russian conscripts.
In the Central Asian republics, ethnic Tajiks and Uzbeks deeply resented being drafted, put in uniform, and deployed to fight and kill their ethnic and religious brethren across the border in Afghanistan.
The pervasive sentiment that our boys are dying for an alien cause eviscerated the moral legitimacy of the central state.
It disrupted domestic cohesion as these republics began to notice stark, uncomfortable similarities between the violent oppression of Afghans and the historical suppression of their own nationalities.
Finally, the Afghan War acted as a direct catalyst for what the texts call participation effects.
The returning, deeply disillusioned war veterans, known as Afghansi, returned to a society that didn't want to acknowledge their sacrifice.
Much like American veterans returning from Vietnam, they were alienated. They fostered the creation of new civil and non-party organizations.
These groups of battle-hardened young men directly challenged the political hegemony of the Communist Party and weakened its monolithic control over society.
Plus, the immense public outcry over the war, particularly from the mothers of the soldiers, forced the media to bypass official censors to report non-official war stories, effectively firing the first shots of glasnost before Gorbachev had even officially codified it as state policy.
Simultaneously, as the military floundered in Afghanistan, the geopolitical landscape in Eastern Europe was being irrevocably, astonishingly altered by Gorbachev's foreign policy.
Facing internal ruin, Gorbachev explicitly renounced the Brezhnev Doctrine.
For decades, the Brezhnev Doctrine had provided the ideological justification for Soviet military intervention to preserve communist rule in satellite states. The world saw this brutal reality when Soviet tanks rolled in to crush democratic uprisings in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968.
But faced with severe domestic economic constraints, the crippling financial and political costs of past military interventions, and a desperate desire to integrate with the global economy to save his own state, Gorbachev signaled a monumental change.
He publicly indicated that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene in the domestic political affairs of the Warsaw Pact nations.
This hands-off approach was famously and somewhat humorously dubbed the Sinatra Doctrine by the Foreign Ministry spokesman Gennady Gerasimov.
The implication being that Eastern European states were now allowed to do it their way, just like the famous Frank Sinatra song.
The geopolitical consequences of the Sinatra Doctrine were immediate, absolute, and deeply dramatic. Deprived of the imminent, terrifying threat of Soviet tanks crossing their borders to prop them up, the deeply unpopular, beleaguered communist regimes of Eastern Europe collapsed in rapid, almost dizzying succession during the Autumn of Nations in 1989.
The fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, the peaceful Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, the violent overthrow of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. These cascade of events drastically altered the global balance of power and signaled the definitive, undeniable end of the Cold War.
But the crucial point our sources emphasize is that the liberation of Eastern Europe had a profound, radicalizing psychological impact within the borders of the Soviet Union itself.
As Mark Beisinger notes in the text, the collapse of external communism enormously accelerated and radicalized processes of nationalist revolt within the Soviet Union itself.
Nationalist movements inside the USSR, particularly in the Baltics, watched Eastern Europe on television and utilized that example to mobilize their own populations.
They recognized that an unstoppable historical momentum had built against the communist state.
When domestic dissidents saw the Kremlin let East Germany, the crown jewel of their external empire, go without firing a single shot, it proved conclusively that the Kremlin had lost the absolute will to enforce its rule through bloodshed.
It severely, permanently degraded the deterrent power of the KGB and the military.
It is also important to contextualize the role of Western political posture during this period. While the historical consensus strongly indicates that the primary drivers of the collapse were decisively internal, the economic rot and the structural flaws, the policies of the United States under President Ronald Reagan exerted supplementary, exacerbating pressure on the fragile Soviet system.
Right. Reagan escalated the Cold War arms race, abandoning the détente policies of the 1970s, and declared his explicit goal to transcend rather than simply contain communism. The sources state that this renewed military buildup, including initiatives like the Strategic Defense Initiative, essentially forced the economically stagnant Soviet Union to attempt to compete in high-technology military development.
A sector where, as we discussed with the computing gap, they were severely disadvantaged.
This competition further drained their already starved civilian economy.
Furthermore, Reagan's frank rhetorical assault on the moral foundation of the Soviet system, labeling it an evil empire and predicting its ultimate demise on the ash heap of history, provided vital ideological encouragement to dissidents globally and deeply challenged the psychological confidence of the Soviet elite.
However, the historiography is clear. Western pressure acted as an accelerant upon a system that was already structurally compromised, rather than the primary cause of its implosion.
And it's worth noting the nuance of the subsequent American administration. As the Soviet system actually began to violently fracture, U.S. policymakers under George H.W. Bush adopted a highly cautious, reactive policy.
They were primarily concerned with ensuring a soft landing.
They sought to avoid doing anything that would inadvertently worsen Gorbachev's position or spark a violent Yugoslav-style disintegration, prioritizing the absolute security and containment of the vast Soviet nuclear arsenal over actively fomenting the immediate breakup of the Union.
Now, as the economic crisis deepened into a depression, and the central state lost its monopoly on both political authority and fear, we see an incredible, almost poetic historical irony play out.
The Soviet working class, the theoretical and ideological bedrock of the Marxist-Leninist state, the very proletariat the state claimed to champion, began to actively, aggressively mobilize against the regime.
This massive shift manifested in a wave of coal miners' strikes that swept through the vital energy-producing industrial regions of the Donbass, Kuzbass, and Vorkuta, starting in July 1989.
The evolution of these miners' strikes is incredibly telling regarding the death of the state's legitimacy. They began with highly localized, purely economic grievances.
The miners, doing some of the most dangerous work in the world, were demanding better wages, adequate food provisions in their company towns, and basic hygiene products like soap.
The simple fact that heavy industrial workers in a superpower had to go on a massive strike just to obtain bar soap highlights the absolute abysmal failure of the consumer economy we discussed earlier.
But as the macroeconomic environment continued to deteriorate, and as hyperinflation instantly wiped out any initial wage concessions they won, the labor movement rapidly radicalized.
By the spring of 1991, during a massive second wave of strikes involving hundreds of thousands of miners, their demands were no longer just about soap or meat.
They became explicitly, dangerously political. Striking workers demanded the immediate, unconditional resignation of Mikhail Gorbachev.
They demanded the complete dissolution of the Federal Congress of People's Deputies and the legal transfer of industrial assets and mine ownership from the Federal Center in Moscow directly to the respective Republican governments.
The miners began actively collaborating with the Democrats aligned with Boris Yeltsin in Russia.
This alliance effectively fused grassroots, working-class labor militancy with the elite-driven push for Russian sovereignty.
These massive strikes paralyzed the already fragile energy sector, decreasing vital coal output by 18% from 1990 to 1991, and costing the staggering Soviet economy billions of rubles in lost output.
But more importantly, it proved definitively to both the world and the Politburo that the Communist Party had irrevocably lost the allegiance of the proletariat.
So let's look at the board in early 1991. You have an economy in freefall, resorting to barter. You have republics declaring their own laws supreme and withholding taxes. You have deeply disillusioned military. And you have the working class actively demanding the president's resignation.
This brings us to the endgame: the referendum, the coup, and the final dissolution.
By the spring of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev was effectively a president without a functional country. The war of laws and the catastrophic economic situation had rendered the central government in Moscow largely irrelevant.
In a desperate final bid to preserve semblance of the federal state and bypass the incredibly uncooperative Republican legislatures, Gorbachev organized a massive nationwide referendum on March 17, 1991.
The question posed to the citizenry was deeply revealing of Gorbachev's desperation. He asked whether they supported the preservation of a renewed federation of equal sovereign republics.
The results of this referendum yielded a deeply polarized landscape that perfectly reflected the terminal, unfixable fracture of the Union. 6 republics entirely officially boycotted the vote: Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Georgia, and Armenia.
These are states that had already elected fiercely nationalist governments and were actively legally moving toward full independence.
But the data from the participating republics is full of nuance. Within the remaining 9 republics that did participate, including Russia and Ukraine, the measure actually received substantial support.
The aggregate data from the March 1991 referendum shows that out of roughly 148 million votes cast, which represented an impressive 80% turnout of eligible voters, over 113 million voted yes.
That is 77.85% voting for the preservation of the Union.
It strongly indicates that despite the massive failures, there was still a lingering, profound desire among the broader populace for stability and some form of continued integrated union, even if it had to be heavily decentralized.
Armed with this mandate from the populace, Gorbachev met at a presidential estate called Novo Ogarevo with the leaders of those 9 participating republics.
They engaged in months of tense negotiations to draft what was called the New Union Treaty.
This treaty was designed to heavily decentralize power, effectively transforming the rigid, centralized Soviet state into a much looser, almost confederal structure, while maintaining a unified military, a single foreign policy, and a common president.
The anticipated, highly publicized signing of this New Union Treaty was scheduled for August 20th, 1991.
But history took a dramatic turn, preempting the treaty with a fatal miscalculation by the Old Guard.
On August 19th, literally the day before the treaty was to be signed, a cabal of high-ranking military, KGB, and Conservative Party officials, men who Gorbachev himself had appointed, staged a coup.
They dubbed themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, or the GKCHP. They cut off Gorbachev's communications and placed him under house arrest at his vacation dacha in Crimea.
They rolled tanks into the streets of Moscow and attempted to seize absolute control of the state, to violently halt the signing of the treaty and roll back the reforms.
But the August coup collapsed in humiliating, total failure within just 3 days. It was destroyed entirely by the culmination of everything we've discussed: elite defection, institutional decay, and mass civil resistance.
Hundreds of thousands of Muscovites, including students, intellectuals, and those battle-hardened Afghan war veterans we mentioned, poured into the streets.
They amassed around the Russian parliament building, known as the White House, to physically defend Boris Yeltsin, who had emerged as the focal point of resistance.
Yeltsin, famously, in a masterstroke of political theater, climbed atop an idling tank sent by the coup plotters to publicly denounce them and demand Gorbachev's return.
The critical defining moment of those 3 days, as highlighted by our sources, is that the coup plotters lacked the ruthless, psychopathic resolve of their Stalinist predecessors.
They hesitated to unleash mass, indiscriminate violence against their own citizens.
The turning point came when the plotters ordered elite military and KGB counterterrorism units, most notably the highly trained Alpha Group, to storm the White House and arrest or kill Yeltsin.
Those elite units, assessing the situation and the massive crowds, simply refused to obey the orders. They refused to fire upon their own people.
That precise moment, the elite military's refusal to act, marked the ultimate definitive collapse of the state's coercive capacity. A totalitarian state cannot exist if its enforcers refuse to enforce.
The state evaporated because the people holding the guns no longer believed in the system enough to kill for it.
The coup leaders, realizing they had no power, were arrested. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but the coup attempt had fatally undermined his political standing and entirely, permanently discredited the central government apparatus.
In the immediate aftermath, real power shifted definitively and permanently to the Republic elites, primarily Yeltsin. The Communist Party of the Soviet Union, the entity that had ruled for over 7 decades, was suspended, and its massive financial assets and real estate were rapidly seized by Yeltsin's Russian government.
The dramatic failure of the coup wildly accelerated the push for immediate, full independence across all republics. The legal, bureaucratic termination of the USSR occurred swiftly just a few months later.
On December 8, 1991, the leaders of the 3 core Slavic republics, Boris Yeltsin of Russia, Leonid Kravchuk of Ukraine, and Stanislav Shushkevich of Belarus, met secretly at a secluded hunting lodge in Tusculi, within the Belovezskaya Pusha forest.
There, bypassing Gorbachev entirely, they signed the Belovez Accords.
This document definitively legally declared that the USSR as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality ceases its existence.
The Belovez Accords simultaneously established the Commonwealth of Independent States, the CIS. This was a loose, toothless regional organization designed essentially to facilitate a civilized, nonviolent divorce between deeply integrated economies and militaries.
Crucially, it recognized the sovereign borders of the former republics under the legal principle of iuda possidetis, meaning they universally agreed to keep the exact administrative borders they held before the collapse, forestalling widespread territorial wars.
Recognizing the absolute fait accompli established by this powerful Slavic core, 8 additional post-Soviet states, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan joined the CIS on December 21, 1991, by signing the Alma-Ata Protocol.
The Alma-Ata Protocol was the final, undeniable nail in the coffin. It removed any lingering constitutional ambiguities regarding the end of the Soviet state and preemptively accepted the resignation of the now stateless Soviet president.
With the institutional and legal frameworks of the empire entirely dismantled, Mikhail Gorbachev formally addressed the nation and resigned his post on December 25, 1991.
On that exact same evening, the red Soviet hammer and sickle flag was lowered over the Kremlin for the final time, quietly replaced by the Russian tricolor. It was a quiet, bureaucratic end to a 74-year global superpower.
To synthesize this massive, complex historical journey we've taken through the sources, the collapse of the Soviet Union defies simplistic, monocausal explanations.
That wasn't merely an economic bankruptcy, nor was it solely a political revolution from below.
It was a comprehensive terminal systemic exhaustion that touched every single facet of the state apparatus. We saw a centralized command economy, which was highly capable of rapid early industrialization through sheer brute force, become a suffocating, lethal straitjacket in the nuanced era of information and microcomputing.
Kept artificially afloat for years by a temporary influx of global oil revenue, it ultimately succumbed to a catastrophic, internally generated crisis characterized by repressed inflation, the total disintegration of supply chains, and a humiliating regression to primitive barter.
And while the economy turned, the political architecture of the state proved incredibly brittle.
The ethno-federal structure, originally designed to manage diversity and project a faux image of sovereignty, provided the exact pre-built institutional mechanism required for rapid national fragmentation once the central coercive apparatus lost its resolve and legitimacy.
Gorbachev's dual policies of perestroika and glasnost acted as the ultimate fatal catalysts.
They simultaneously broke the functional mechanisms of the command economy, while completely destroying the carefully curated historical and ideological myths that had long justified the regime's very existence.
The core takeaway for you as a learner navigating massive, complex institutions today is profound. Institutions, no matter how heavily armed or globally feared, require trust, adaptability, and a fundamental alignment of incentives to survive.
The Soviet Union failed catastrophically on all three fronts. It structurally demanded adherence to rigid quotas over technological innovation. It consistently lied about its history and its environmental disasters. And it created a perverse economic environment where working for official currency became literally pointless.
When an institution forces its people into those conditions, its demise is merely a matter of time and triggers.
So we've broken down the economics, the nationalism, and the political blunders. But it leaves us with a final, lingering question to mull over, one that builds on everything we've unpacked today about human incentives. We noted from the sources that the Soviet elite, the nomenklatura, ultimately reinvented themselves as nationalists. They abandoned the state apparatus they had served their whole lives to secure private property and political power for themselves during the chaos of the collapse.
Which is a remarkable pivot.
So ask yourself, did the Soviet Union ultimately fall primarily because its foundational ideology was defeated by its own contradictions? Or did it simply fall because its own leaders, the factory managers, the mayors, the party bosses, looked at the writing on the wall and realized they could personally profit far more from the death of the empire than from its survival?
It's a provocative thought to leave you with.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the historical narratives around you and keep exploring the incredible complexity of our world.